Hey, my friends. So, it's been a while since I made a video about reading Marseille or doing anything related to pip cards or Marseille cards or anything like that. And so, chatting with my friends, just sparking ideas for videos, came up with this one and thought it would be really cool. And it's cool to me in part because I actually don't read this way all that much. Like, I'm not a super visual person, and so this is not, I would say, one of my stronger suits, is working with the visual language of cards, but I actually do think it's a really great technique, and it's also something that's actually really common in Marseille readings, is that the image is far more supreme than I tend to work with it. And I think that's cool, partly because I really don't, work with the images all that much. Like, I'll look at where people are looking. And I think it's an interesting thing, too, because when people think about Marseille decks or other pip decks, one of the things that kind of gets in the way of their attraction to them is the idea that they're not as visually interesting. There isn't as much visual information to work with. And so it's sort of like, well, they're just not as pretty, and there's just not as much to work with in that regard. And yes, and there's also a lot to work with. And so I think that when you're reading, you can do this. And it's really, really traditional to do it. And so when I was preparing for this video, I went back to some of my some of the books that I read as I was researching Tarot and Earth, as I was learning myself. And so Yoav Bendov mentions it in the open reading. This is a book that's now published by Llewellyn, and it's called The Marseille Tarot Revealed, but it's the same content. And Camelia Elias talks about it in her book, Marseille Tarot Towards the Art of Reading. And those are two of the ones that do quite a bit. And then Enrique Enriquez in Tarology. Tarology? Is that what this is called? Yes, it is. That's what it's called. Well done, me. So in this book, he talks a little bit about the visual. What's interesting about this book, this is a book that I always recommend with reservations. I think it's a really well-written, really inspiring book. There's a really good documentary, actually, that you can watch, I think on Amazon or maybe iTunes, about him. It's a little inscrutable. I think it's written to sort of the mind and the eye of a poet. And I am not that. But I do think that there's some interesting things in here. And what's really fascinating to me in this book is how he will talk about the language on the cards, the titles of the cards. I think that that's principally useful if you actually speak French, because you will know how the sort of cognates of language, and the rhymes and the little sort of cool things that happen in French when you read the titles out loud or say them out loud. You'll get these little kind of puns and these twists. And this book, Tarology, is really, really about that, probably more than even the picture. But all of these books and more mention using the images as kind of a supreme part of the reading, and really kind of the principal focus of the reading. And I thought I would sort of talk through that and just demonstrate how you can do that, and that you can, in fact, use the pictures on the cards to tell the story. And let's just dive into it. I think, there's not a whole lot to say about... Oh, I did want to sort of just give you an example. I bookmarked a couple things because I thought they were interesting. I thought it would be fun to sort of say, oh, here was an example. And this is Enrique Enriquez is quoting someone here, but it's an example of how, the name on the card can be something that actually inspires meaning. So he here is quoting a writer who wrote the book Tarot: An Answer from the Future, which is a French book from 1985. And this writer says, to call the fool, the card that bears the name Lamat, is to deprive ourselves from a very rich source of information. Besides, it would be like freezing the card's meaning while suppressing all the weight the unconscious gives to homophonic names. Lamat in Arabic means death, is only used in chess in reference to the king who cannot leave its place without being captured. The mat, who has no number or space, is outside the tangible order, and even so he is leaving. This apparent paradox gets enriched by another traditional meaning. Mat is a mix of copper and sulfur. It's also an object lacking luster. The mast of a ship is how that is connected to Latin. And it allows the boat to sail forward properly. So, like, there's all this sort of stuff that is very poetic and very kind of languagey in Enrique Enriquez's book. So it's very much a part of how he reads, but also I think, something that's kind of interesting and tangent to this, but not obviously the visuals. There was something I also wanted to say about that, but I don't recall what it was, as so often happens. So, I guess what I was going to say too is that it's pretty common for tarot readers and Enrique Enriquez's one to only use the majors and the trumps, and because they're the ones that have scenes on them. So there you go for folks who feel like reading with Marseille is less interesting. But Yoav Bendov talks about how you can do that, but you don't have to, and then you can open the minors can open things up. In Camelia Elias's book, she tends to use, in the examples anyway, the minors to add more information. So she'll shuffle the deck separately, use the trumps for the beginning of the reading, and add pip cards to gain more context, which is very, very important in reading, in case you haven't heard that. So, the other thing that's always important is that we have a question. I'm jumping ahead of myself. That is important, but it's not where we're going quite yet. What's important, or what I was going to say was, I'm going to do, in these samples, I'm going to go both ways, as it were. And I'll do some that are just trumps, and I'll do some that are trumps and pips. And actually, what I'm going to start with is a method from Yoav Bendov where you shuffle and then you keep laying out cards until you get a trump card, and then you use and then when you get the trump card you move on, and I'll demonstrate that in a second, so that you have the minors underneath for more information. All right. So what I was saying was that having a question is super duper helpful, and I don't think it's useful to read, especially this way, without one. I mean, you can certainly create a narrative that will help you make sense of things, but I just feel like a question, it's what we do. We answer questions with readings. So, all right. So I'm going to be adventurous today and try to insert video that I'm also shooting simultaneously of the cards, because I'm getting adventurous here in quarantine land. All right. So we're going to questions are important. So let's say that this is a romance question, and a man would like to know what his ex-fiancée from years ago is thinking about him today. All right. So I'm going to use the Yoav Bendov method, where we're principally going to read the trumps, but we'll have the minors underneath as, context. All right, so we start with, we've got, let me just make sure that's in frame up there. So that was the Six of Wands, and we have Death. So I've got two cards first, right up there, all right? And so next we've got the Three of Swords, the Seven of Swords, the Queen of Swords, the Ace of Swords. So we've got a lot of cards under here, and then Judgment. Now, when I do this, which I actually don't really do all that much, although I do like the technique quite a lot and probably will use it more often now that I've kind of reacquainted myself with it, I will stop at a face card, not just a trump card. So anytime one of the court cards shows up as well, I have a person who's looking somewhere, and so that gives me, that is readable to me. So I would do that. I would read that way. And then finally we have the Six of Wands, the Ten of Cups, the Ten of Swords, the Ace of Pentacles or coins, and the Emperor. All right. So let's tidy up our little packets of cards here. If I should zoom in here, let's do it. This is such a unique experience. All right, so what we're doing in this video is I am reading without, and this is a little bit of a challenge for me because, again, I'm not a visual thinker, but the point is to help you see that you can do this if you want to. I'm not going to use any of my traditional associations with the cards or any of the meanings, keywords. I'm going to use the pictures to tell a story that answers the question as a way of showing that you can read sort of the way people read Rider-Waite-Smith, right? That you read the pictures principally, and then any other associations you have kind of complement that. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do when I do something like this is I'm going to look at kind of where people are looking, right? And I have a spread here. We have, again, Death, Judgment, and the Emperor sort of all looking at each other. And Death and the Emperor are both looking toward the center, and the Judgment card is in the middle. And it's so fun. It's so like interesting to do this again because like I want to start talking about like all the associations, but what I want to do is describe what I'm seeing. And so I have a reaper sort of reaping a farm, right? Reaping the land. And it's a skeleton, and it's pretty desiccated, and everything in the land is pretty desiccated as well, you know. And something that, you know, the writers who write about this, Camille Elias and Ben Dov in particular, will talk about color, you know, even the mistakes in the cards. Now, these are sort of cleaned up reprints or restorations, but if you were to use like a reprint of a vintage deck, then you will see a lot of kind of spillage of ink, and you know, on an example that Camille Elias uses in her book, there's like red ink that's sort of coming out of the magician's shoe, and she's like, there's fire coming out of his foot, and so like little things like that are gonna like inspire and connect you to meaning. So, so it's like pretty desiccated landscape. It's like someone is trying to like get something to grow in an environment where something won't grow. You know, it's just, this is not fertile land. And then in the middle, we've got sort of a blast of sound, and these people are sort of shook, and they're like, holy crap, you know what I mean? I'm awake. Like, please don't keep blowing this horn in my face. And then I have the Emperor. I have this sort of stern man with a big stick ready to kind of bash people down. You know, he's got a shield. He's looking at the number 4. You know, that could be something interesting. He is number 4, so that's something that's kind of interesting. And he's looking up to the 4. He's actually not even looking at the other cards. So he's sort of looking above what's come before him in the reading. And so just looking at those images and just thinking through it that way, I have kind of a pretty good picture to answer this person's question, which is, you know, how does his ex-fiancée feel about him now? And, you know, looking back, I have a character who's looking back, which that's the Emperor, right? And that makes sense because we're asking how someone feels about this guy now. Looking back on the experience, this person kind of is ready to bash down these memories of this blasted, you know, this sort of shock of realizing that they were trying to harvest something from land where nothing could grow, and they were drying away in the process. And so, not a very pleasant answer for our intrepid querent here, but that's how the fiancé feels, is that there's not very good memories. And so, without even thinking about what the Emperor is or does, without thinking about the metaphorical or biblical associations with the Last Judgment, without thinking about all the goopy stuff we have about death, we can answer the question purely based on the images and how the cards are interacting with one another, which is kind of dope. All right. So, as I said, Yoav Ben Dov will use the other cards, the pip cards that are kind of underneath for additional information. And so there's a lot for the middle one. So I don't think I'm going to be able to fit all these in here, but let's try. So under death was the Six of Wands. And under judgment is the Ace of Swords, the Queen of Swords, the Seven of Swords, and the Ace of Swords. Yeah, I'm not going to fit all that in there. Let's zoom out. And then under the King is the Ace of Coins, the Ten of Swords, the Ten of Cups, and the Six of Swords. Now, I don't need all of this information, honestly. I have an answer. But, like, if he wants to know why or how could this be, as, you know, some men tend to do, you know, I can sort of go there and sort of explain more and, like, look at the situation or one part. Like, what, you know, why did she stay with me if she was sort of trying to work ground that wasn't working? And the Six of Wands is like, it felt, you know, it felt kind of sexy to do that. Like, you know, it was something she was used to. She was invested in the relationship, certainly invested in the passion. It felt good to do that. But when, you know, when the horn blast came, she got her weapons out. She got her power back. And she realized what was important to her. And she, you know, she learned a lesson and she got out. And now she's got a new life. And she's definitely feeling like she's got her shit together. And she's done with the relationship with the Ten of Cups under there. And she's got a new balanced way of thinking about her life. And so, you know, you can go for more information, which I think is kind of really rad. So let's do one more example like that, where we're kind of principally worried about the old Trumpy Trumps. I think I'm going to start calling them the triumphs because I'm sick of the word Trump. So let's say that this question is, oh gosh, you know, there was a quote in Camellia Elias's book that said something like, if it weren't for love questions, there would be no such thing as fortune telling. So let's keep it on brand. So let's say that this is a question about, oh, I dropped a card. That it's a question about someone who is at the beginning of a relationship. She really likes this guy and she's kind of wondering what's up for the next couple months. You know, where is this going to go? Is this going to develop into anything cool? All right. So as before, we're going to do our little piles. So we've got the Five of Cups, the Page of Swords, the King of Swords, the Queen of Cups. There's a lot here. This Seven of Cups and the Star. And then in the next pile, we've got the Ten of Wands, the Eight of Swords, the Two of Cups, the can't count, Five of Swords, and the Fool. And then we've got the Four of Coins, the Nine of Swords, Two of Swords, and Justice. Let's get up close and personal there. Now, I'm not going to worry too much about the pip cards underneath here, just because I don't have a lot of space to be spreading them out, and there's a lot in here. And also, I feel like you can get a pretty good answer. What I like about this is having the options to dig deeper if we want to. I think that is always a cool thing. All right, so now we're going to look at the situation purely based on the card images. And so we've got the Star. So we've basically got like a naked woman out in nature, pouring forth generous amounts of what appears to be water. And then we have the Fool, who's kind of tromping along with his bag of tricks, oblivious to the fact that there's a cat attacking his ass, and walking straight into Justice. And Justice has got the sword up and the scales balanced and staring straight out at the future. And, not really having any shit, and not interested in taking any shit. And the other things that we notice, the Fool and the Star are turned back to back. Obviously, the Fool is moving right towards justice. And another thing that Camille Elias and I think Enriquez look for is kind of the visual rhymes. Like she'll say the cups in the Star, or the jugs in the Star, turn into the scales in the Justice card, and are connected to like the two little flaps in the fold of the Fool's bag at the top. You know what I mean? So she'll look for visual rhymes, in order to kind of see if there's anything that makes sense or connects the cards that way. I have a harder time kind of seeing those things. I tend to sort of focus on where people are going, what they're looking at, what they're doing. Sometimes I'll notice something like this will turn into that, will turn into this, but I don't. You could say the Fool's staff turns into the sword on justice. You could say that the water in the Star kind of continues below the Fool's feet, and then that all kind of dries up under justice. Now, again, we're not sort of bringing into the equation that the Star represents hope or directionality for me, like compass points for me. We're just engaging the idea that it's a woman who's naked outside under a starry sky pouring water. And then we have the Fool who's like taking his pants off or having his pants taken off and picking up and walking away with his stuff, and straight into Justice, who's like holding up the sword, got the scales, staring straight out, not looking to the future, not looking to the past, looking right at us. So the question was, where is this relationship going to go, or is there any potential? What's going to happen with this new person that she likes in the next coming months? And so, like 3 or 4 months. And so what I see initially is very much someone who's kind of pouring themselves out, pouring all of their stuff out, and then packing up and moving away. And kind of just taking their stuff and moving along to something much more severe, something much more, defensive, and staid, And so what I would say is that she, sort of represented by the Star, is kind of like pouring all of this stuff out of her at her, into this relationship, into this person, and is like giving so much of their energy to it, that it might actually cause the person to kind of pick up and leave, because what they would ultimately prefer is something that's more standoffish, much more severe. They don't want to have to take in all of that person's energy. And so they're kind of just going to go because they can't handle this output of emotion, or this output of energy. And they would much prefer something colder, that they don't have to sort of absorb that much of, for example. And again, we can use the cards underneath for information. There's just so many in this case that I feel like, for an example, we could spend a long time doing this. But you could also do it, just to sort of see what makes sense. Like, for example, the Justice card for me was the hardest one to sort of parse here visually. But underneath, there's 2 sets of swords. There's the 2 of swords, there's the 9 of swords, and then there's the 4 of pentacles. And so there's no, I can start to now pull out like the normal associations. There's no love here. It's like swords and money. That's, they're just interested in guns and money, basically. They're not looking for something that requires that much emotional investment. I said I wasn't going to do this, but I'm doing it anyway. Under the Fool, we've got more swords, the 5 of swords, the 2 of cups, the 8 of swords, and the 10 of wands. And so, we have the 2 of cups and the 10 of wands there, so there is probably some kind of attraction emotionally and sexually, but it burns out really fast with that 10. And this person's just someone who kind of constantly needs to be intellectually stimulated and just be thinking about things that are exciting. And then under the star, we've got a lot. There's a lot going on for this person, right? So we've got the 7 of coins, the Queen of Cups, the King of Swords, the Page of Swords, and the 5 of Cups. And so, there's kind of a movement here from like maybe an emotional sort of passion breakup kind of moment that left them feeling kind of bruised and defensive, and like now they're coming into their own and they're ready to sort of like reevaluate what's important to them in life, and what's important to their life is kind of putting things out into the world to have like a really great relationship. So I really like this idea of doing this, and I don't do it much, but I can absolutely see doing it more because I think it's dope. And of course it's dope because Yoav Ben-Dov was rad. I love his writing. What a just fan. So that's using the trumps, which is kind of easy. It's probably what you're sort of used to working with Rider-Waite-Smith. You're just sort of sussing out the visual language. Now, you can do this with the pips not hiding underneath. And that's what we're going to look at next. And it's a little harder. I think you have to think more abstractly. And also think kind of literally about what the suits represent or what they look like they are in any given situation. Excuse me. So let's come up with another question, and just because we're on the theme, let's do another love life question. So let's say this person wants to get back in the game after taking some time to like work on themselves, and they feel like they're ready to get out into the world, and what do they need to know about the dating landscape? Grim, probably. So in this case, I'm not going to count, or I'm not going to sort of wait till we get a trump card. I'm going to just lay out the cards, the first 3 cards. So what can this person expect from the dating landscape? We've got the 4 of swords. We've got the 3 of cups. And we've got the Knight of Cups. And we're totes out of frame, so let's get that in there. So again, working with just the pictures, we're not thinking about the numerological associations, the elemental associations, any Rider-Waite-Smith associations. We're just looking at the pictures. And if we are lucky enough to have a person card in a spread, that's usually where I'll start. And we have the Knight of Cups, which just sort of like, it's pinging inside me. I can't not think about the elemental associations, right? But Knight of Cups. So we've got this person with this big open cup, and they're like on a horse, and they're riding off to find other cups. And they do find other cups. They encounter the 3 of Cups. And what's interesting is that, from 2 cups grows sort of this third. But the third is so protected, and, it's not completely, separated from the others, but, these 2 cups kind of reach up and, like, hold it in, and they're, like, it's not free. And then there's this garden, this sort of walled garden, where, like, a single flower grows, but you can't get to it. It's completely walled in, and there's really nothing on the outside of it. So it looks sort of bleak. You can see it's there because the wall is sort of like a fence, you know what I mean? It's woven, but it's not, you can't get into it. And the knight doesn't appear to have any weapons. They just have this cup. They just have this thing that they're offering out and holding out. And so sort of working with a narrative that way, what I would start to see is like you'll as you go out into the world with this cup, as you ride off into the dating landscape, you'll see that there is potential there, but that there's a lot of couples, and the folks that might be free are kind of contained, and they're hard to kind of get past and get through these pairings. There are all these pairings, and you sort of want to get to that other cup. And in fact, if you look at the way the knight is holding it, it's almost like they're toasting to this third cup, but it's a little protected by this thing. And in fact, I would say that it looks like these two bottom cups are sort of actively protecting the cup from any outside engagement. So it's like there may be people out there who like have single friends who are like, yeah, but like they're not for you. And as you go deeper into the woods, you see this garden, you know what I mean? You see this rose, like Beauty and the Beast or like the secret garden, right? And, it just won't, you can't get into it. So you'll see this thing that you want, but it's like totally protected from you. And it's you start to sort of feel that cup empty. You're like, I want this thing, it's right there, why can't I get it? And it's because it's protected. There's this theme of people or things being protected from or kept away from this person. And so this is sort of the fairy tale of like the knight going off to find the princess and having to like cut through all the brambles. And so what this person is offering is this sort of open cup. And sort of being that vulnerable as you go into the world may not be the best choice, because you might need something else. You've worked on being the Knight of Cups and sort of opening yourself up, but you might need more defensive tactics to sort of navigate this world well. And then, of course, we could bring in our associations if we want to. But again, the point is just, with just that visual language, with just that impression, you can answer the question pretty effectively if you're sort of thinking abstractly and looking at the image and sort of working with what you see there. So let's do one more. Oh gosh, I mean, let's say this person is like, should I end this relationship that I've been in for 3 months because I feel like the fire's going out? Something like that. I hate should questions, but they are ones that come up a lot. Shoulds, coulds, woulds. And I think what I sort of internally do is I'll rephrase that as something like, what will happen if I do this internally. And I'll just sort of answer the question they asked, but with that point of view. I was going to get into a thing about rephrasing. I've done videos about that. Like, I won't rephrase questions to the person, but I will tease it out in my mind in a way that will give them a helpful answer. All right, so we've got the 3 of Wands, the 6 of Wands, and the 3 of Coins. And so no people cards in this case. So this is a great example. This is an interesting one to work with. So the 3 and the 6 both look like X's. You know what I mean? There's this sort of big, like, these crossed X's. And actually it gets thicker as you go along. And the kind of elaborate, or not really super elaborate, but the kind of big arabesques on the 3 get smaller as they go into the 6. And just numerologically, without associations, 6 is twice 3. And so whatever happens even more. It gets more intense as time goes on. And then, so the 3 of Coins, very similar to the 3 of Cups in the previous spread, there's this very singular element who can kind of see other pairings out there but can't get to other people. And in fact, I said pairings, that's not even really it. All 3 of the coins are actually separated from each other by these vines. And so, what will happen, again, this is very, very subjective, right? But just thinking kind of objectively through this, what could happen is a feeling of like, so I've gotten out of this relationship, but now it's like, it just makes me think of Family Feud, when you get the answer wrong and it's that noise, it's like you get that twice, you get that a lot, and then you discover that you're sort of alone in these things, and you can see other people kind of living their lives, and like they can see you, but like you become very isolated from the world for a while. And so again, it's not the answer to the question, should I do this? I would need to, so what I asked myself was, what will happen if this happens? What I would phrase this as is, so if you do that, here's what you'll probably end up feeling. And if you're okay with that, then maybe you should. Or if that sounds appropriate, maybe you should. Maybe this person wants to feel isolated. Maybe they need some time for themselves. Maybe they're like the opposite of the previous example where it's someone who just had done that. Or they don't want that and they don't want to feel isolated, and maybe they find ways to spice things up. So, that's an example of that. So anyway, I think that this is a really cool method. I think for folks who are kind of nervous about reading with Marseille style decks, or who are like, they're not visual enough or they're not pretty enough, like, I would encourage you to just play with this example. And you can, you know what I mean? And I think this is a really useful way to do it, especially if you're learning a system and you want to read, you know what I mean? Like, if you read my book, I do sort of put you through the ringer in order to kind of develop your system, but you can do this right away. And I don't talk about this stuff until sort of the end, because it's not really how I read. Sometimes the visual language will inform me, but it's not paramount. It's not the primary thing that I work with necessarily. So, but I do think it's cool, and I think it's definitely got historical precedent. Like, it's a far more traditional way of reading with the Marseille decks than I actually teach you, and the way that I actually do it. Not that the way I do it is wrong or bad. It's just this sort of thing is much more traditional. And in fact, so is just reading with the majors. That is very traditional, particularly in French schools. Not literal schools, but in the French traditions of reading tarot, is that you leave the pips out of the deck. Some readers will use the aces, and will incorporate the aces and the trumps. I think that's what Enrique Enriquez does. But yeah, so as usual, I hope this was interesting. I hope it was cool. I hope the examples were fun, and I hope you're well, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll be back soon. Be good.